If I'm in this constant sympathetic state, then my immune system is going to be suppressed. We ask, why are people more susceptible to getting sick and not? It's because their immune system is shut off, because my stress is always turned on, because my brainstem is just getting this imbalanced, chaotic neurologic input, which then makes my brain perceive stress, and now it's just a constant cascade day in, day out that can go undetected for decades.
And how many of you are familiar with cortisol? What cortisol is? When is cortisol released? Under high amounts of stress. Exactly. Cortisol is released under high amounts of stress. The adrenal gland is going off in high states of stress, and that high state of stress is coming from a nervous system imbalance because the body is not able to effectively process and regulate it, which is why the whole process of care is to be able to increase the body's resiliency to stress and decrease the stress load. And when we do that, that's where we start to see the symptoms start to go away, because we're actually addressing the cause rather than just the symptoms. Just more research that looks at stress, inflammation, and depression.
And that's all vagus nerve function, all that stuff.
And so what are some signs that you have autonomic imbalance? Essentially, you can have low parasympathetic or high sympathetic. You either have a very low ability to respond to stressors in the rest and digest mode or repair mode, or you can have high sympathetic. You don't have to have one or the other. You can actually have both, and that's what we test for. We try to see exactly which one are you more dominant in, and then be able to characterize the care program based off of that, based on the individual.
And so we should see these be balanced.
Yep.
Such as if I'm in low parasympathetic, see, notice how that can lead to chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or thyroid issues. These all show up as individual things, but what if they're all connected? What if there actually is one root source that's leading to all these being expressed and they're being addressed as individual things? Even in here, if I'm high sympathetic, I'm that high fight, flight, freeze. We have anxiety listed here, poor sleep, ADHD, neurodevelopmental. Kids that are coined ADHD, they're just in a high hyperactive nervous system state, in which case they need to go run around and play in recess and interact with kids, not just sit at a desk for 6 hours. It's not how young humans are supposed to be. They need to be actually moving and expressing and burning off those energy.
Exactly, and designed to move. And so you brought up a great point, because people typically, when they think of chiropractic, low back pain and neck pain. And so that's what'll bring people in, or unless they hear about us, like, I have migraines, or I have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, all this stuff. They come in with a major condition, but then they also have, I have fibromyalgia, but I also have neck pain, but I also have migraines, and I also have chronic fatigue, and I have all these different things. And so what I tell them is I say, well, here's the thing. I understand that you're coming in for your fibromyalgia, but the reality is, what we typically tend to do in the system is we tend to say, your fibromyalgia is different than your leg pain, is different than your arrhythmia, which is different than your migraines. All of it is just completely separate. What if all of it was actually connected? Altered vagal tone. This is a ton more research on altered vagal tone and autoimmune and chronic diseases.
Yeah, that's showing this, all these studies are showing that when I have suppressed vagal tone, when I have my just hyper-dominant sympathetic system, and so my parasympathetic system is being suppressed, my vagus nerve is being suppressed, then that can lead to autoimmune conditions starting to sprout up, or dementia starting to take root and snowball for decades at a time, or multiple sclerosis itself, which is an autoimmune condition, plaques of the neurologic function in our brain.
Again, more research, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, Parkinson's. And so when we look at this, I'll keep this up here. So when we look at this, autoimmune conditions, again, what's happening in an autoimmune condition? The body is doing what? The body is, exactly.
It's fighting itself.
And so why would the body ever want to fight against itself? And it's because of the chronic stress that it's been undergoing up to that point. Because the reality is, autoimmune conditions don't just pop up. It's not like, one day I didn't have Crohn's and then the next day I did, right? A diagnosis was the only difference between the day before and the day after. The reality is it was a process to get to that point. And so if what we can do is measure the system, measure the stress of the system to make sure that the process doesn't have to pop up, or if it's already popped up, identify the missing link, identify the system, and then backtrack it, we can get to the cause. But a lot of people, especially when they get tested for a thing and they're like, now I'm diagnosed with XYZ. But the only difference between the day before and the day after was the test. So did you have fibromyalgia a year before you got diagnosed? 2 years? 5 years? We don't know, because we weren't testing the process of it. Again, just some more research looking at the pulse and heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is really big. Heart rate variability shows us the integration of the nervous system. What heart rate variability is it's measuring the amount of beats between each subsequent peak on a graph. So essentially, the shorter the heart rate variability, the more stress that's on the body. The higher heart rate variability, the more the body's able to respond to stress. He and I, we're big, obviously, nervous system buffs. We have our Apple Watches. We're constantly competing with each other, saying, "Look at my heart rate variability," and things of that nature. And it's because we like our body to be able to respond to stressors, especially when it comes to patient care and things of that nature.
Yeah. One thing I'm noticing on this is correction of chronic, maladaptive, so inability to adapt, inflammation using nerve stimulators. So basically, nerve stimulators, vagus nerve. What this is saying is when we stimulate the vagus nerve, when it is functioning correct, we prevent the progression of debilitating and deadly diseases. Why is that? The link between that is because the vagus nerve is what allows these little immune system warriors that are throughout our body to relay that message to our brain saying, hey, we got a bad guy in here, I need resources, or I need the key to unlock the memory cells that we keep talking about from what we get from vaccines when we get exposed to a virus from a cold or whatever. The vagus nerve is that connection point. That's actually what's transmitting the information from my brain to say, hey, here's the key. You can go now unlock the barracks and let's let the warriors out. But what if this vagus nerve is being suppressed 24/7? That's why some people are prone to getting sick when they have all the vaccines. They've been doing everything to benefit their immune system by eating well, exercising, sleep, yet they're still susceptible. That's basically what this is saying is when the vagus nerve is turned on, because it's allowed to, because my system is not stressed, I'm able to prevent the progression of debilitating and chronic disease.
And again, in this study, what they've done is they stimulated the vagus nerve. And you can get vagus nerve stimulators. I've had patients that have come in using, like, yeah, I've been using vagal nerve stimulators, but we can stimulate the nerve all we want. But as soon as we take the stimulator off, the body doesn't have the process to keep it stimulating. So then that's why they end up coming here. I tell them, like, you don't need the vagus nerve stimulators because we're about to stimulate it and get your body stimulating it by itself. Again, just the vagus nerve has anti-inflammatory properties. The reason why it has these anti-inflammatory properties is because when that vagus nerve is functioning properly in the autonomic nervous system, the body's able to reproduce that stress more effectively and disperse that stress as it's coming in.
Yep, so vagus nerve, anti-inflammatory, which can help reverse issues such as irritable bowel disease or inflammatory conditions such as RA. Autoimmune conditions is just a response of high levels of inflammation and stress, which causes flare-ups. That's how autoimmune conditions start getting triggered and result in flare-ups. Exactly.
And big thing is, obviously without the use of vagal nerve stimulators, what are some ways that we can improve our vagal tone? Number one, of course, positive social relationships. So finding a group of people or finding a loved one where you can actually have a good time, that's going to help increase the vagal tone properties. Number two, cold exposure. We're both really big into cold exposure. Cold exposure is extremely good for the nervous system. I see you back there. You're like, cold. Yep. Cold, whether it's a cold shower or getting in a cold tub, that's what we like to do. Get in a cold tub, what it does is it helps shock the system, and when you get into it, especially when you stay in it a while, it shocks the system, and then the system learns to fight against the cold, and then it starts to relax, and that's how the body's able to increase the vagal nerve properties with cold exposure.
Yeah, so leave these up. So a lot of these, I see some people writing these down, just keep on doing so.
Yeah.
A lot of these are you're intentionally putting your body in some kind of either stress or relax. Like cold is an intentionally stressful thing. Exercise is intentionally stressful. The rest are actually vagal nerve stimulators, but in terms of the stressful ones, when you intentionally put your body in stress and force it to stay in there and actually deal with it, then you're going to be more resilient, more prepared to deal with the unpredictable stressors that come on in day-to-day life. It actually allows the part of your brain that can stay under the reason, the logic, still be able to stay calm. You're training that part to override your stress response. Our stress response in our brain is so just ready to fire. It's ready to draw on us like, come on, give me something. I want to get going, right? I've been off all day. It's only 7 a.m. Why haven't I been triggered yet?
Right.
And if you're able to actually train your different area of your brain to be like, nah, whenever that stressor comes up, because it's going to come up multiple times in the day, we're able to maintain reason, logic, and we're able to actually work through this in a deductive way and move on, get past it, and it didn't actually affect or just ruin my entire day. The rest of these are actually stimulating your entire parasympathetic system, in which case vagus nerve is the main chief dominator of that, and the control panel for that is in our brainstem.
And obviously, we said 10 ways. We're missing number 10. Number 10 is obviously exactly what we specialize in, upper cervical care. So what about chiropractic and vagal tone? Again, we were talking about this already, where what we see is through a series of visits, and that's what the care program is designed around. Throughout a series of visits, what we're able to do is actually increase the body's vagal tone to be able to respond to these stressors more effectively. And why does it do this? Because of this term called vertebral misalignment or vertebral subluxation. Subluxation doesn't make sense to people, so I use the term misalignment, okay? But what's happening is when the body's under a state of stress, the muscles start to tense up, and those muscles, that intramusculature that's inside of our system, these little micro muscles, they start to pull the neck. That's why you see a lot of people walk around like this, especially as they grow older, because they've been under so much stress. And so what's happening is the body's responding to the stressor, and it's pulling this misalignment out from the upper neck. And when it pulls that misalignment out, that's what causes the interference between the brain and the body, and the body's not able to effectively process and regulate those stressors that are coming in.
And so we believe that not everybody needs to be adjusted per se, but everybody deserves to be checked.
Yeah.
Everybody deserves to have their nervous system checked. We're able to actually do that and measure how well your central nervous system is flowing, how well your autonomic nervous system is flowing, if your parasympathetic, sympathetic, that switch is balanced, how well that brain-body communication is going, because here's our brain here, essentially down here's our body, this is the connecting point. If I have misalignment of either the first or the second bone in the neck, then that's going to impede, choke off that flow. Our brain is constantly creating healing instructions, but imagine, does it feel like it's actually getting choked off at that source?
Yeah.
Our body is essentially getting starved of this healing instructions mechanisms, and it can't get itself out of that. It's stuck in it for decades.
Because the brain is trying to send that blueprint to the rest of the body. It's the same thing that took us from 2 cells that came together to every single person that's sitting inside of this room, right? So that very system that's coordinated everything is always trying to send a blueprint to our bodies to be able to heal. And what can happen is this misalignment causes the body's inability to do so. So obviously we know that structure affects function. We're actually under the belief that function can also affect structure. So it kind of works in tandem. It kind of works both ways. So when you have this misalignment or the vertebral subluxation, there's neurological and physiological impacts that are put onto the body, and the body expresses itself as something known as what? Symptoms. Because it's not able to regulate the stressors.
And so when we have, so there's a couple things that I noticed on this. A, spinal cord tension, that sounds like stress in my brainstem. Okay, and what do we say about stress in the brainstem? Brainstem gets stressed, that's going to make my brain perceive stress. That whole stress cascade goes and is on. In terms of brain blood flow, my brain requires a constant supply of blood. Why? Because it cannot store glucose. So we can't store energy, so I need a constant supply of energy. And it needs oxygen to create energy. My brain is only, I think it's about 10% of our body weight, yet it uses up 60 to 80% of our body's energy.
The entire.
It's a churning machine. And so blood flow to my brain actually travels through the neck right here. You can see this red part, and it goes in the top bone of the neck. And so if there's a misalignment of the top bone of the neck, it kinks that blood flow, almost like kinking a hose. So my brain is not getting ample blood flow that it's used to. So then what's the response? It's going to say, I need glucose, I need oxygen. And how it's going to do that? It needs more blood, so it's going to ramp up my heart rate. It's going to ramp up my blood pressure. It's going to mobilize all my stress hormones to get my food, to mobilize sugar stores, fat stores, to then get glucose in. And we say, oh, I have high glucose levels, then you're pre-diabetic. It's going to activate all of our stress hormones. They're going to be stuck in that state, and it can't get out of it. And increased inflammation, that's vagus nerve.
And the CSF flow.
Yep.
CSF flow is huge when it comes to fibromyalgia and migraines. That CSF flow, if we have this upper neck kink, that kink in the hose, that misalignment, what's happening is our body's not able to effectively process the cerebrospinal fluid that's going from the brain to the spinal cord and then back up to the brain. And so this kink, and we have to understand that fluid responds to what? Responds to pressure. And so if you're experiencing symptoms because of these barometric pressure changes that are happening, it's because the body's not able to effectively process the cerebrospinal fluid, and so the body responds in a shock-like sensation and causing that major flare-up.
Yep. And when we, you have something to say?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, the biggest thing that we have to do is we have to test and see, is the nervous system functioning or is it not? You know, the power doesn't come from the adjustment. The power comes from holding your adjustment. When you're holding your adjustment, that means that everything is balanced, and when you're holding it long term, that's when the body is able to effectively respond to the stressors, and we go back from the state of disease back to the state of vitality and health. And how we test it is via computerized infrared thermography. It's a fancy term. Essentially what it means a functional nervous system scanner, and this is just an indication of what it looks like, okay? So what the entire goal of care is to make these crooked lines as straight as possible for as long as possible. This is one of my patients that came in at the beginning of her care program, and this was actually her first scan, okay? This one right here, that was her first scan. And then what we ended up doing is by her coming in, obviously throughout a care program and a series of visits, she actually was an anxiety depression case, and that was her major complaint. She was young, and thank God we caught it early. And so what happened is now she's able to walk around with this, meaning that as she goes out there, stress, work, school, and as all these different stressors are coming in, when you're walking around like this, that means your body's able to respond to stressors way more effectively.
So these lines, this is when we say that we're able to measure central nervous system function, how well our autonomics are doing, that brain-body connection. This is what we're talking about. In which case, we're actually running a scan of our central nervous system, seeing how well it's doing, and we should see balance. We talked about balance with sympathetic, talked about balance with parasympathetic. We should be able to see balance, in which case a straight line pretty close to this blue line is reflecting that. But if I have this waviness, such as this blue scan is showing, that shows us that central nervous system function, there is an imbalance in my autonomics, there is an issue or an interference with my brain-body communication that typically no one has ever told them about, and they've been dealing with all of these symptoms and effects for so long, but the cause has been in pressure and issues and stress on the brainstem, which is a reflection of these graphs and these tests that we run every single visit.
And so a lot of these conditions that people are diagnosed with, they're called idiopathic. And in the medical community, what idiopathic means is we don't know where the cause is coming from. But yet when you look at the research of the pathophysiology behind a lot of these different conditions, especially with fibromyalgia and autoimmune disorders, what you see is that they actually are like, yeah, we understand that we understand that it's coming from the central nervous system, but there's no way to test the central nervous system. But it's like, that's what we're able to do. But of course, they don't want to trust the chiropractors, right? Because, we're witch doctors, and obviously people think that there's a battle between medical doctors and chiropractors. There's not. I work with medical doctors, I work with nurse practitioners, because they understand the concept, because this is a different form of chiropractic. It's not the one form of chiropractic that everyone thinks it is. This is just research showing chiropractic in vagal tone. Obviously what we want to do is we want to increase the body's vagal tone. I'll let you take a picture of it.
So when talking about restoring the central nervous system in those scans, what does that is by a correction of either the first or the second bone of the neck, which one for which per person is determined by x-rays. But that is the cause of central nervous system dysfunction, and everything else is compensations or effects. And so we only address the cause. We only detect and correct issues with the upper neck. We do not work with low back. We do not provide massage or thumper or Theraguns or PT. We only do that check. And if you absolutely need to be adjusted, in which case most of the time you don't, because you should be functioning over time through this care, then the goal is to get you from a state to where you're in disease to a state of health, and where you're just coming in to get your nervous system checked, not necessarily adjusted.
And this right here, just really quick, this one, think of it as the fire. Not only is the fire alarm going off, but there's massive smoke inside of the building. This right here, we finally took the patient out of the smoke, and we went in there with the fire hose and we put the fire out. Very similar to like an EKG looks at heart function or an EEG looks at brain function. What we test for is nervous system function. So that's the way I explain it, so it makes more sense to people. This is just more research on chiropractic and vagal tone. This is chiropractic and decreased inflammation. And again, why does this make sense? Very similar to what we talked about in the beginning, because when we increase the vagus nerve and increase the function of the autonomic nervous system, the body's able to respond to inflammatory stressors more effectively. Again, more research, heart rate variability in patients with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. They make a case for testing the nervous system, seeing if there's a problem inside of the nervous system. And if there is, get it corrected. So what causes, let's just wrap all this up, what causes nervous system interference? Obviously stress, which is what we talked about this entire presentation. When we have that increased stress response and our body's not able to respond to stressors, such as physical, chemical, and mental stressors that are coming in, then what happens is our body's not able to effectively regulate the stress and process this stress. And so it creates an autoimmune response, it creates migraines, it creates fibromyalgia, it creates all these different conditions that no one knows where the cause is. It's actually coming from a body's inability to express or deal with stress.
Yeah, so it's from that brain healing mechanism getting choked off. So physical, that could be a fall or some kind of head trauma, or maybe could even be stepping off a curb and sneezing weird. Chemical, that can be the foods that we eat or what we breathe, the air. Mental, emotional, that can be something happening to a family member, that can be from a conversation from someone close to you that did not end up going the way that you hoped it was going to go.
We always tend to focus on the physical. Always tend to focus on the physical, or you fell off a horse, you got in a car accident, and things of that nature. Obviously, we love to focus on the chemical as well. What you eat, is it organic or is it not organic? These things matter, but what we don't focus on, and I often see it a lot in my patients, is the emotional side of things. A divorce, an abusive relationship, something that happened in their childhood, and a lot of stuff pops up after this emotional response, and it's because that internal fire alarm keeps happening from that car accident, keeps happening from that childhood trauma, keeps happening from that food you ate at that Mexican restaurant that you had no business eating, right? The body keeps in response to the stressor, and that internal fire alarm keeps going off, and it goes off for a prolonged period of time, and the body's not able to appropriately delegate stress because of that choke point, and leads to the chronic conditions. So how common is the upper neck misalignment? 1,000 infants were checked in the first month of life. 80% were found to have this misalignment in their upper neck.
And this is a medical study.
Yeah, this is a medical study.
Showing that essentially at birth, during the birthing process, 80% of infants after the birthing process have a misalignment of the upper neck. And so dealing with those who have upper respiratory disease, or they're not breathing right, or they're not able to sleep, they're colic.
Yep.
It's because there's an issue with the brainstem. They're trying to tell me like, hey, I got this thing going on here, help me out. During the time when you're an infant and a toddler, that's the most important time in your development of your nervous system. And they're showing that of every 1,000 infants, 80% of them have this issue, which means your entire life potentially you might have been dealing with this, and yet symptoms might not arise until your 30s, 40s, or 50s.
But you wouldn't know. That's why I'm super glad of UAMS reaching out and getting this involved, because you wouldn't know unless you get checked for it. As soon as my daughter was born, I got her checked. As soon as she was born. And it's because what can happen, obviously, if you continue to grow up and this misalignment is still present and still there, and that nervous system interference isn't properly working, that's why when they're younger, patients will come in the door, my child's just screaming, I heard you can help. It's like, okay, so obviously colic symptoms is probably because there's a choke point in the brain. The baby's responding with colic at a young age, saying that, hey, there's something wrong. Had a patient that came in with cyclic vomiting syndrome. I know no one's probably ever heard of this. Cyclic vomiting syndrome at 5 years old, and she's been dealing with migraines ever since she was 5. Or dealing with migraines ever since, I had this one patient that came in, you remember him. I had this one patient that came in, and he came in, he was literally crying, because it was such a beautiful moment, man. I get choked up thinking about it, because he was actually getting ready for his first appointment. And I had just finished up a care program with a patient that suffered from migraines, and she was coming out, and we were saying our good wishes and farewells and stuff like that. And then she was talking to him and said, just trust the process. Trust the process. Trust what he says. Trust when he says no adjust. Trust when he says adjust. Listen to his recommendations and show up to the appointments. And he was in tears. Yeah. And now he's able, and he's still going throughout care because it wasn't that long ago. He's still going throughout care, but he's a big bodybuilder. He's still in high school, but he's a big bodybuilder, and now he's able to, lift and not have to worry about it. He just broke well, I guess I can't say that, but he just broke a record in Arkansas for something particular. So it's absolutely incredible the work that we do every single day. Hello.
Hey.
How are you?
Doing well. So again, how common is the misalignment? 1,250 infants were evaluated during the first 5 days of life, and again, they had an upper neck misalignment. And in this guy, the reason why I brought him up is because he's been dealing with migraines for literally as long as parents can remember. His first words were head, and then he learned head hurts. He's like, head hurts, and he just continued to grow up. And he's done everything under the sun. I've had patients go all the way to Mayo Clinic. I've had patients go to Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic. Still no results because they're testing for all the wrong things. They still get great results with what they do, but especially if it's coming from a neurological condition, a nervous system issue, and we're not correcting the system, that's what happens. The birth process, even under optimal controlled conditions, is harmful, just naturally. I had a natural birth. Oh, I guess not me. Lord forgive me. Yeah, not me. My beautiful wife had a natural birth. I was a support system. My hands had to recover from that. Thank God it took a couple weeks off. But we had the most natural birth possible, and obviously it was still pretty invasive. And so birth, just in general, is invasive, just by nature. And so obviously we know that there's nothing that we can really do, which is why it's also super important to get the children checked as well. And so what are there's many other side benefits of chiropractic care that we're not going to work through, okay? You can take a picture of this, you can do your own research on chiropractic care, on upper cervical specific chiropractic care in general, but obviously there's people in the room that are like, well, either me or a loved one is suffering from fibromyalgia, autoimmune conditions, and all these other different things, or you just want to get your nervous system checked. We're actually opening up an opportunity to be able to do so, okay? So what it looks like is it just looks like a consultation, and what it is you'll come in for a consultative appointment. What we'll do is we'll run a couple scans and see if there's anything going on inside of the nervous system. And if there is, we'll talk about obviously what next steps look like moving forward. But we believe that every single man, woman, and child should be checked for neurological interference to either work back the stuff that we're dealing with or to prevent it from even happening. And so we really hope that you found value from this presentation. Again, I hope I didn't massively screw up. I hope that you guys actually got a ton of value from this. If you want to take advantage of the consultation, I'm actually going to be in the back. Dr. Chris will be up here. If you have any questions too, you can come up here and talk to Dr. Chris. I will actually be in the back right there setting up consultations. And so what we actually do is we'll take a $25 deposit to be able to solidify your spot, and it's only going to be over the next 2 days. And if you have questions, you can come up and talk to Dr. Chris. But before we break, does anyone have any questions? Any open questions that you'd want to address?
So do you have people that come in and get this done and everything's fine? There's not issues?
Oh yeah. It's actually the hardest conversation to have. It's actually the hardest conversation to have is when, and I get choked up thinking about that too, because I've had those cases where they've come in, they've had everything under the sun, they've already been to all these different places, and then I run a scan, and it looks like that first one. And then obviously I tell them, like, I can't just start you under care just because we'd actually be doing more harm than good, because there's actually not a problem that I can fix. And that's why it's super important for me to be able to work with other medical doctors, nurse practitioners, and things of that nature that have a more holistic approach for an individual that may not necessarily be candidates for care. I really believe in the integrative approach because the doctors that send me people, they haven't been seeing results, or they think that they're a better fit for us, or the people that I run a scan and they're not candidates for care. We just kind of go back and forth. And so that's how we end up getting the long-term results. But yes, we do have that. And those are the hardest conversations to have, for sure.
How do you hold an adjustment? You had said something about that earlier.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so you've been in this state for potentially years at a time, potentially decades, in which case your brain thinks that this is normal. This is what my normal is. I mean, you can run a scan and show you that this is not normal for you. We're not comparing you to some arbitrary average, we're comparing you to you. And so, especially in the early phase of care. So I'm sure probably a lot of you are wondering, well, what does care even look like with you? How does this process actually look? Why are you guys able to address all these things here that medical profession has had difficulty in trying to unravel? What does it look like? Because I'm sure there's probably some points during this presentation